Imagine going to the hospital for a broken leg and leaving with a teaspoon of plutonium injected into your bloodstream. This isn't science fiction. For 3 years, the U.S. government deliberately injected 18 people with one of the most radioactive substances on Earth. They used code names to hide what they were doing. They told patients nothing. Some were children as young as 4 years old. Most never found out what happened to them, even decades later. This is the story of how America turned its own citizens into human guinea pigs in the name of nuclear superiority. The year was 1945. World War II was ending, but a new kind of war was just beginning. The Manhattan Project had successfully created the atomic bomb, but scientists faced a terrifying problem. They had isolated plutonium, a substance so dangerous that a speck smaller than a grain of sand could kill you. Yet they knew almost nothing about what it did inside the human body. Animal tests weren't giving them the answers they needed. The Cold War was heating up, and thousands of workers in bomb factories needed protection. Military personnel would be handling nuclear weapons. The government needed to know exactly how much radiation exposure humans could survive. So they made a decision that would haunt American history forever. They decided to inject plutonium directly into unsuspecting patients. The first victim was Eb Cade, a black construction worker from Tennessee. In April 1945, Cade was in a car accident and broke his leg. He was taken to Oak Ridge Hospital, where doctors were supposed to help him heal. Instead, they saw an opportunity. Without his knowledge or consent, they injected him with plutonium and gave him the code name HP-12. For weeks, they monitored how the radioactive poison spread through his body. They even pulled out 15 of his teeth and cut bone samples from his body to track the plutonium's path. Cade wasn't told any of this was happening. When he started to suspect something was wrong, he tried to escape the hospital. The staff stopped him. Eventually, he was released, but the damage was done. The plutonium was already working its way through his organs, slowly destroying him from the inside. But Cade was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, 17 more people would receive similar injections. The victims included terminally ill patients, healthy individuals, and even children. The youngest was 4-year-old Simeon Shaw, who was brought to the hospital with what doctors thought was bone cancer. They injected him with plutonium and gave him the code name CAL2. The boy died 255 days later. The experiments weren't limited to plutonium. 6 people received uranium injections. 5 got polonium. 1 person was injected with americium, another deadly radioactive element. The government was turning human beings into living laboratories. Scientists used code words to hide their work. Plutonium was called 49 or simply product. Official documents never mentioned what they were actually doing. Even many of the doctors didn't know the true nature of the experiments. Patients who asked questions were told they were receiving experimental treatments for their conditions. The truth was kept locked away in classified files. One of the most shocking cases involved Albert Stevens, a 58-year-old house painter from California. In May 1945, doctors told Stevens he had terminal stomach cancer and only months to live. They offered him an experimental treatment that might help. Stevens agreed, desperate for any chance at survival. What he didn't know was that he was perfectly healthy. The doctors had misdiagnosed him on purpose to justify the experiment. They injected Stevens with the largest dose of plutonium ever given to a human being. The amount was microscopic but incredibly dangerous. Stevens unknowingly carried about 1/128th of a teaspoon of plutonium in his body. That tiny amount gave him a radiation dose 300 times higher than what's considered safe today. He became a walking nuclear accident. But here's the twisted part. Stevens didn't die. The plutonium didn't kill him as quickly as the scientists expected. He lived for 20 more years, dying in 1966 from a heart condition completely unrelated to the radiation. For 2 decades, he carried enough radioactive material to power a small nuclear device, never knowing he was one of the most contaminated humans in history. Now here's something that will make you question everything you think you know about medical ethics. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to tell you next shows just how deep this conspiracy went and why it took 50 years for the truth to come out. The scientists running these experiments knew exactly what they were doing. Internal memos from the time show they understood the moral implications of their work. In 1950, Joseph Hamilton, one of the lead researchers on the Manhattan Project, wrote a warning to his colleagues. He said the experiments had what he called the Buchenwald touch, comparing them to the horrific medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors during the Holocaust. Think about that for a moment. A scientist working on these projects directly compared what they were doing to Nazi war crimes. And yet the experiments continued. The Atomic Energy Commission, the government agency overseeing nuclear research, kept conducting radiation experiments on unwitting citizens until 1950. They weren't just injecting people with plutonium anymore. They were feeding radioactive breakfast cereal to children in state institutions. They were injecting pregnant women with radioactive isotopes to see how it affected their unborn babies. They were exposing prisoners to radiation without their knowledge. The scope of these experiments was mind-boggling. In 1949, the government conducted something called the Green Run experiment at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington state. They deliberately released massive amounts of radioactive iodine and xenon gas into the atmosphere over populated areas. Families living nearby had no idea they were being used as test subjects to see if the military could detect Soviet nuclear activities. Thousands of soldiers were marched through radioactive zones after nuclear tests in Nevada. Entire communities, known as downwinders, were exposed to radioactive fallout from bomb tests. The government knew these people would develop cancer at higher rates, but they considered it acceptable collateral damage in the name of national security. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these experiments wasn't what happened during them. It was what happened afterward. For decades, the victims had no idea what had been done to them. The government buried the evidence in classified files and moved on. The people who had been injected with plutonium went about their lives, many developing strange illnesses and cancers, never understanding why. Eb Cade, the construction worker who was the first victim, died in 1953 from heart failure. His family never knew about the plutonium injection. Albert Stevens, the house painter with the massive radiation dose, lived his entire remaining life without knowing he was carrying a nuclear payload in his body. Even when some of the victims were finally contacted by the government in 1974, they weren't told the full truth about the health risks they faced. This cover-up might have continued forever if not for one determined journalist. In the early 1990s, Eileen Wellsome, a reporter for the Albuquerque Tribune, began investigating mysterious references to human radiation experiments in declassified government documents. She spent years tracking down the real identities behind code names like CAL-1 and HP-12. Her investigation uncovered the full scope of the plutonium experiments and revealed the names and stories of people who had been erased from history. The series won her a Pulitzer Prize and forced the government to finally acknowledge what they had done. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established an advisory committee to investigate human radiation experiments conducted by the U.S. government. Their final report, published in 1995, concluded that at least 30 different government programs had intentionally exposed American citizens to radiation without their informed consent. The committee found that these experiments violated the medical ethics standards that existed even at the time they were conducted. The government eventually offered small financial settlements to surviving victims and their families. They issued official apologies and promised it would never happen again. But the damage was already done. Entire families had been destroyed by cancers and illnesses caused by radiation exposure. Trust in government and medical institutions was shattered for generations of Americans. What makes this story even more disturbing is how it reflects the mindset of the era. Government officials genuinely believed that national security justified any means necessary, including using their own citizens as expendable test subjects. They convinced themselves that the greater good required individual sacrifice, even when that sacrifice was involuntary and uninformed. The plutonium experiments weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of government-sponsored human experimentation that included the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, LSD experiments conducted by the CIA, and countless other programs that treated human beings as laboratory animals. But here's what's truly terrifying about this story. It shows how easily ethical boundaries can be crossed when people believe they're serving a higher purpose. The scientists and doctors involved in these experiments weren't cartoon villains. They were respected professionals who convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary and justified. They created elaborate justifications for their actions. They told themselves the patients were going to die anyway, so the experiments weren't really harming them. They argued that the knowledge gained would save countless lives in the future. They claimed that national security took precedence over individual rights. These same justifications have been used throughout history to commit atrocities. The Nazi doctors at Buchenwald used similar reasoning. They claimed their experiments served the greater good of advancing medical knowledge and protecting German soldiers. The parallel that Joseph Hamilton drew wasn't accidental. What's particularly chilling is how the cover-up worked. For nearly 50 years, the truth remained hidden through a combination of classification, misdirection, and institutional amnesia. Documents were buried in classified files. Witnesses were sworn to secrecy. Official records were sanitized to remove any mention of the experiments. Even when some details began to emerge in the 1970s, the full scope of the program remained hidden. It took a determined journalist digging through thousands of pages of declassified documents to piece together the complete story. How many other government experiments remain hidden today? The legacy of the plutonium experiments extends far beyond the immediate victims. It fundamentally changed how we think about medical ethics and informed consent. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II to prevent the kind of medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors, was largely ignored by American researchers. It wasn't until the full scope of these experiments became public that serious reforms were implemented. Today, medical research is governed by strict ethical guidelines that require informed consent from all participants. Institutional review boards oversee human experiments to ensure they meet ethical standards. These protections exist because of the horrific experiences of people like Eb Cade, Albert Stevens, and 4-year-old Simeon Shaw. But questions remain. How do we ensure that the pursuit of scientific knowledge never again overrides basic human rights? How do we maintain trust in medical institutions while acknowledging their capacity for abuse? And perhaps most importantly, how do we prevent future generations from repeating the mistakes of the past? The plutonium experiments serve as a stark reminder that scientific progress built on human suffering is not progress at all. The knowledge gained from injecting unwitting victims with radioactive materials could have been obtained through ethical means, even if it took longer or cost more money. The decision to use human beings as test subjects was a choice, not a necessity. As we face new ethical challenges in medicine and scientific research, from genetic engineering to artificial intelligence, the lessons of the plutonium experiments become more relevant than ever. We must remain vigilant against the temptation to sacrifice individual rights for collective benefit, no matter how compelling the justification might seem. The story of America's plutonium experiments reveals a dark truth about how easily ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when they believe they're serving a greater cause. But there's another government program from this same era that makes the plutonium injections look like a minor ethical lapse by comparison. This program involved thousands of victims, lasted for decades, and its effects are still being felt today. The worst part? Most people have never even heard of it.